So first of all, say a big thank you to Ellen and Sandy. Say hello to Ellen. I say both Sandy and Ellen were instrumental in getting the book published. You know, I went to Ellen at a fairly early stage, and both her and Sandy were enormously supportive and encouraging. This was at a time when the idea that I was wrestling with, I didn't know made sense or not. So your encouragement, Ellen and Sandy, are hugely instrumental in helping my thinking and in getting the book in place. I'd also just like to say hello to John Ashton. The last time we met, John, I think, was in a coffee shop up near IIEA when you were giving a talk there, the Irish Institute for Economic Affairs. I think you're the first and only person still, you hold the record of being the only person who broke into song during your talk at the IIEA. So that's a record you still hold. So it's good to see you too, John. In the first 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about, there's 4 ideas I'm going to talk about this evening. Yeah. So I'll talk about the first 2, which are the idea of dangerous personality disorders and the idea of the toxic triangle. So the first 2 of those ideas, one of them is the kind of people who are dangerous. And the second one, the toxic triangle, explains how these people come to power. And then once we've had a discussion, a break, as Sandy says, the second 2 terms I'll talk about in the second half, one of them is pathocracy, and the second one is about democracy as a defense against pathocracy. Don't worry about what those mean for the moment. I'll explain that in the second half. So to begin with, dangerous personality disorders. I'd like to start by saying we're talking about mental health. We're talking about issues of mental health. And so it's important to say at the beginning that the 3 disorders that I'm going to be talking about, psychopaths, narcissistic personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder, are 3 of 12 documented personality disorders. And the rest of those personality disorders, as with mental illness in general, are not a danger generally to other people. So in no way do I want to stigmatize mental illness by what I'll be talking about. These are 3 very specific disorders. Most cases of mental illness and most of the other personality disorders cause much more distress and harm to the person who has them than to anyone else around them. These 3 disorders that I'll talk about are the exception, in that they're much more dangerous to other people. And in fact, as I argue in the book, the people with these disorders, when they get to power, are responsible for some of the worst atrocities that we've seen in the 20th century and across history. So I'll explain sort of briefly what these 3 disorders are. I say psychopaths is one, narcissistic personality is the second, and paranoid personality is the third. Of these 3, there's still a lot of research and discussion about the causes of the disorder and about whether they're treatable or not. So it seems, though, from the evidence that we have, from what we know, there seems to be a difference between psychopaths on the one hand and the other 2 disorders, narcissistic personality disorder and paranoid personality disorder. Psychopaths seem to have much more of an organic component, if you like, that people can be born psychopaths, that there's a genetic and organic component, that people are born. And essentially psychopaths are people who lack conscience. There's an absence of conscience. Another way of thinking about this is that psychopaths don't have the machinery, if you like, or the emotional machinery to relate to other people or to recognize other people as people. So in the book I talk about, I think it was William Wordsworth had a poem where he talks about the mute conversations that we have as infants with our mothers and fathers' hearts. So before we have language, there's the language of love, there's a language of hugging, the language of touch, the language of laughter, looking in our parents' eyes, our mother's eyes, and seeing the reciprocal sort of language responses to our own feelings. So that language, we very, very quickly come to recognize the difference between people who respond to us and communicate with us in those emotional, non-linguistic ways, and things which do not, obviously. So one way of thinking about psychopaths is that they don't have that distinction, that people are just another category of things. So to my mind, when I was researching the book, when I was trying to understand, atrocities like the Holocaust, like the killing fields in Cambodia, about the Gulag in Russia, about Hitler, obviously, the Holocaust and so on. That made an awful lot of sense to me if you think about psychopaths as people who just simply look at other people as things. And for example, in the trial of Adolf Eichmann, for example, the coldness and the way that he talks about sending 6 million people to their deaths in gas chambers, there's no emotional response. There's nothing. It's as if they were sending 6 million logs to be burnt in a fire. So the first category then is psychopaths. We can talk more about that because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. There's a lot about this in the popular media. There are so-called successful psychopaths versus the sort of typical media representation of psychopaths as being Hannibal Lecter and mass murderers and so on. So we can talk about this more in the discussion. The second dangerous personality disorder is narcissistic personality disorder. And I think I'll talk to you a little bit, and Alan, I'd love to hear your views on this whenever we come to the discussion. But I'll talk to you a little bit about how I understand this from a psychoanalytic perspective. And to do that, I'll use a little bit of psychoanalytic jargon here, but you'll understand what it means. You often hear it said that people with narcissistic personality have a big ego. It's actually not true. They don't have an ego. Because in normal human development, if you like, we start off in the position that people with narcissistic personality disorder get frozen into. So in normal, healthy human psychological development, we end up with, we can think of two components in our psyche. One of them is the ego, which is really as the center of our sense of ourselves, our self-confidence, our sense that we are competent, that we can do things, that we can withdraw from others, we can get our own nourishment from ourselves, and that we can direct our own lives. So our ego is our center of control, if you like. And the second component in normal healthy human psychology is the superego. And of course, the superego is, in a sense, our conscience. It's that part of us that's internalized, that's saying when we're doing something wrong, gives us a sense of guilt. So if you like, we have this ego that has a sense of competence and a sense of competence, but throughout our lives, we're being directed in a way by our superego that's telling us if we're going off track, it's telling us, we are doing so. That's healthy human development. In narcissistic personality disorder, what happens is that very early infant development gets frozen in. And if you think of two components in very early infant development as being not the ego and superego, but rather what's called a narcissistic self and an ego ideal. The narcissistic self is what's typical in narcissistic personality disorder. If you think of a very young child, who is asking their parents, little girl, for example, look at me, I can dance, aren't I wonderful? And they're always pestering, look at me doing this dance again, getting the acclaim, getting the attention. And that's a perfectly normal part of necessary part of human development, to get the attention, to get the love that helps us develop. But that sense of narcissistic self, where there's no self-containment, no sense of containment, there's always a need to go somewhere else to get someone to approve. So that narcissistic self, if you think of it as a little child constantly wanting to dance and getting attention and acclaim for their dance. The other part of that, rather than there being a superego that gives us a mature sense of right and wrong, is this what's called the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is actually a very harsh, punishing superego, if you like. If you imagine it's when that very young child is asking their parent to look at them, I'm dancing, aren't I wonderful? And the parent looks at them and says, actually, you're absolutely rubbish. You're trash. There's nothing good about you. And the child then internalizes this really harsh, punishing sense of what's called ego ideal. The child can never live up to this ideal. They can never satisfy the parent. They're always failing. So in narcissistic personality disorder, you get frozen in this narcissistic self, this very childish behavior that's constantly looking for adulation, and at the same time internalize this voice that's telling them no matter what they do is rubbish. So narcissistic personality disorder, I think that personality structure explains at a fairly deep level all of the things that you normally hear about narcissistic personality disorder. Someone who was always looking for attention, they're very quick to turn to rage if people don't agree with them, because that's exposing them again to this voice telling them they're worthless. They're quick to anger. There's a cruelty involved in it with other people. There's an envy. And very interestingly, there's an envy about love, which I think you can see in a lot of, I don't want to name names, but I think you can see it in a lot of media at the moment. There's an envy about love and about people who do have relationships, and any time that there's a sense of intimacy or a sense of care, that has to be destroyed. So that's the second personality disorder. As I say, psychopaths are about 0.5 to 1% of the population. Narcissistic personality is about 0.5 to 1% of the population as well. The third personality disorder is paranoid personality disorder. That too is a very early freezing of infant development that persists right into adulthood. And in particular, what's frozen in is an infant's sense of helplessness and paranoia. So if you think of a very young child that's being left alone, they're hungry. From their perspective, they don't understand the world. They don't know whether their mother or caregiver is going to come back and feed them or not. So at very early infancy, there's this sense of being left alone has an enormous sense of paranoia about it, a fear of the world, a fear that the world is persecuting and that they're going to be annihilated. In paranoid personality disorder, that inner sense of paranoia gets frozen in. And so with people with paranoid personality disorder, they see other people constantly as a threat. They see the world as a threat, and in fact, no amount of reassurance will assuage them. They continually see other people, as I say, as a threat. And they make up about 5% of the population. So when you think about paranoid, when you think about conspiracy theories, you think about supporters of leaders who are stoking paranoia, stoking hatred towards outsiders, then this group of people, they're probably less likely to be overtly violent than psychopaths or people with narcissistic personality disorder, but they are likely to form a big part of the cohort of those who support leaders who are more likely to be violent and persecutor. Very quickly then, that's the 3 personality disorders. The question then is, and it's a question when I was writing the book, is how do these individual pathologies, that's all fine and well, these 3 pathologies are well documented in psychiatric manuals and so forth. There's a lot of research on them as individuals. But the question then is, how do individuals with these disorders get into positions of power, and how do they mold societies in their own image? How does that happen? How does another way of saying this, how does individual pathology become mass pathology? And so I'll say in all of this, this is still a topic of research, of debate, that we're still trying to understand, that as societies we're still trying to understand. But one of the concepts that I found very useful when I was researching the book is the idea of what's called the toxic triangle. And the 3 sides of that triangle are, the first one is the toxic leader themselves. So it's someone with one of these personality disorders. And the second side of the triangle is a critical mass of people who think the same as the leader, or are sympathetic to the leader's thinking, and who make up a very active part of the leader's base, if you like. And the third crucial part of the triangle is much more about the social conditions. It's much more about the environment. And so it is that third side of the triangle is what's called the enabling environment that allows such leaders to gain not only the core followers who think alike, but a lot of the rest of us as well. So you can imagine, particularly if you think in terms of the lead up to the Second World War and the rise of Hitler and so on, the depression, large scale destitution among people in terms of after the Great Depression, the failure of democracy in Germany and so forth at the time, multiple governments and disillusion and so on. that these social conditions can form an extremely important part of the mix that makes a lot of us support these leaders. And the image I have in mind is, if you like, if you think of normal human thinking on a spectrum, you know, with most of us gathered around the middle, some extremes of people who are going to be extremely empathic and extremely generous and so on. At the other end, you have these leaders who are incapable of empathy and cooperation. But when the conditions shift, that graph, if you like, that curve shifts a lot of us over to the left into the thinking and, if you like, justifying the types of extreme solutions that these leaders often espouse. In the research that I've been doing, and then on Twitter and so on, conversations that I've been having, I think there's a lot of times when people are quite incredulous about the idea that such a small number of people would have such a big impact on society, that maybe they're not as bad as you're talking about, that individuals like this aren't really that dangerous. Yeah, they can be contained. And again, we're talking about a particular leader at the moment. They're not going to do that much harm. They can be contained. I think one constituency that really understands the danger are people who have been in relationships with people like this. Mm-hmm. They don't need to be convinced. They've experienced it. Yeah. And so I think, you know, kind of what, in writing the book and in talking about this, yeah, I have a conviction that this knowledge can change the world. If we really understand that this minority has a deeply distorting effect on everything around us. It has a distorting effect on our organizations because these people are our managers. It is distorting effect in terms of our politics. It is distorting effect on economics, you know, when we want to push people out the door back into work because we need to save the economy rather than your grandmother or grandfather. Yeah, I think practically every social institution there is, from politics, economics, religion, is permeated by the thinking of this minority. You know? So if we can distill out that toxicity from all of these social institutions, we'll be in a very different world. And I think we'll be in a world that's much more reflective of our true human psychology. After all, this minority, these are failures of love and care in early childhood. You know, I would argue that the evidence shows that we're creatures that thrive in conditions of love and fun. And that's the environment that we'll continue to thrive in throughout our adult lives. That's the environment we should be trying to reproduce in every one of our social institutions. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think that this knowledge can change the world, that this knowledge really can transform and can help transform our societies. But there's a lot of resistance to it. But one powerful constituency, I think, that already gets this, that doesn't have to be convinced of it, are people who have had experience of this in their relationships. I think that's a very powerful constituency for this message. So that's just to finish a train of thought that we were having in our discussion room. To continue now the second half, the two other concepts that I was going to talk about. One is this idea of pathocracy. Yeah? And if you Google pathocracy, you'll see different definitions of it and so forth. But if we go back to Plato talked about tyranny. He talked about oligarchy, rule of a few. You hear authoritarianism. I think all of these terms are really different terms for pathocracy. And what pathocracy means is, if democracy is ruled by the people, tyranny is ruled by one tyrant. Pathocracy is the rule of a society by this disordered minority. And it's ruled by this disordered minority in every one of the social institutions in society. You know, that they are in positions of power in different institutions, and the whole society then is structured, and the majority of the healthy population are actually ruled over by this minority. Now, again, that might sound like a far-fetched notion, right? But if you read histories, for example, I'll give you a few examples of this. If you read histories of, Anne Applebaum had a book about this, when Stalin took over Eastern Europe, after the Second World War. And all of the Eastern European countries had fledgling democracy, had elements of democracy. And how Stalin went about, first of all, installing the puppet ruler who thought like Stalin, who was going to do what Stalin wanted, the secret police forces, and how they went about through almost every organization in society to plant their people, to put their like-minded people in positions of authority. Even down to the Boy Scouts, And Anne Applebaum talks about, the experience of a couple of Boy Scout leaders who are, and it's a perfect description when she doesn't talk about pathology, she doesn't talk about the personality disorders, she just talks about this process whereby a normal scouting troop suddenly had a few people come in who thought differently, who were more bullying, who were attacking the people who were in charge of them, humiliating them, arguing with them, to the point where these people would then just give up. It isn't really worth doing this. It isn't worth being here anymore. And so you get this process of a number of these individuals coming in, changing the entire culture within the group or the organization, to the point that healthy psychological people just give up and leave. And people who have these pathologies find it much more attractive to join. And again, you can take it everywhere from a Boy Scout troop to a police force, to the army, to whatever organization you want to think of. Again, if you think this is far-fetched, I'm going to have to name him, actually, apologies for this, but you think of what Trump has been doing during the 3 years in office. He has been appointing people who will obey his every command to every level within the structures of the American democratic system, in the courts, across the way. That's a microcosm of what happened under Stalin. It's a microcosm of what happened under Mao, under Pol Pot in Cambodia, where you get the society is completely taken over. The institutions of society become, again, one of the people who wrote about this talked about it as being almost like a crystallizing process, where you get society crystallizes into two layers. The top layer is people who either have these pathologies or are willing to go along with them, and they're the ones that are at the top, and the rest of society is left behind underneath the control of this minority. Again, if you think this is far-fetched, Mao said during the campaigns for collectivization, similarly with Stalin, a common feature of these regimes is that they release violent criminals from prisons to become part of their vanguard of, in this case, instituting collectivization. And again, if you read the microcosm at the very micro level in a village in Russia, where one guy who was the village drunk, who was suddenly given a uniform and a gun and commanded to take control and take the property of all of the wealthy peasants in the village, and how he went about that with absolutely no compunction, shooting people and so on. Stalin, or Mao too, understood this. Mao said, give me 2 individuals and I'll take over a village. He knew what he was talking about. He knew what the 2 individuals he was looking for were. And again, I was saying, in the case of Mao had got a thrill from violence. The first time that he was involved in the uprising, when he was involved in torture, he found that this was really thrilling for him. Right? And he suddenly realized that something that terrified the majority of people, he actually found fun. This was an enormous power. And it's a power that he used right throughout his rule in China. So again, recently I've been reading, if this sounds fanciful, I've been reading recently a book by an Egyptian author about the current regime in Egypt, or about how people experience Middle Eastern regimes in the Middle East. And he described it, again, he doesn't talk about it in terms of pathology and psychopaths and narcissistic personality and so on. He just talks about, imagine an entire system has evolved where you have the secret police, you have the university professors, you have everyone in society who is going to act in this way without the bidding of the leader. So the ruler doesn't have to order people to suppress dissent. He doesn't have to order people to persecute people who speak out or people who resist the regime. He doesn't have to do anything like that, because he already has a structure in place all across society of individuals who will do this of their own volition, yeah, because that's their way of being. So that's the idea of pathocracy. Yeah. The last idea I want to come on to, and I apologize if this is terrifying, you know, so I want to talk about something that's on a more hopeful note, which I do see. There are a number of things in this that I find incredibly hopeful. One of them I've mentioned already, and that is the fact that violence, oppression, you know, excessive greed are actually pathologies. They aren't part of our normal nature. Most people want to be spending their time with family. Most people want to be spending their time following the passions that they have, whether that's music or art or reading or whatever. That's what most of us want to be doing. Most of us don't want to be sort of on top of a massive, you know, apparatus that's oppressing other people and involved in violence against others. We can be sucked into that, but that's not our normal human psychology. So there's and again, I mentioned earlier in terms of evidence of early childhood development and neuroscience and so forth, that shows that our brains need this love and fun, the act of hugs and laughter and touch and so forth. This is evidence that we're creatures, that actually our normal, healthy psychology is one of those kinds of empathic and cooperative interactions. That to me is an enormous hopeful sign. Yeah, it signposts where we can go in the future as a species. We more and more shake off this pathology, and we more and more recognize our underlying true human psychology. That's not, for me, an enormously hopeful thing that we've discovered, and we've discovered through science, through psychology, through psychoanalysis. The second thing I think that is enormously hopeful is that, in my mind, history, I think of history as being, we've been in this struggle pretty much throughout, certainly throughout modernity, certainly throughout the historical record, that we have had individuals who would take control of societies and subjugate the majority of people. And we've learned that now. We've learned, if you think about the struggle, I talk about democracy at the moment, but you think about the struggle for democracy going back to ancient Greece. I look at that as a 2,000-year long struggle between the healthy majority to try and minimize the influence of this pathological minority on the rest of society. So, and I think we're already a long way down that road of minimizing their influence. So very quickly then, the final thing, having talked about pathocracy, what can we do? What is the solution? Obviously we don't have the full solution yet, because these people still have a lot of influence. But I think democracy, and in the book I talk about this, to my mind, democracy, we should think what democracy is. We have a kind of narrow view of democracy as being about elections and changing leaders every 5 years. To my mind, democracy is actually a fairly complex system for defending against these individuals from coming to power. And if they do come to power, how to limit them and how to remove them from power. So again, because I don't have too much time, I'll just talk about this very briefly. But going right back to ancient Greece, the whole idea of democracy was about an agreement between everyone that we won't revert to violence if we lose the argument. We'll have a democratic discussion, we'll have a vote, and the losers then agree to abide by that vote. We won't revert to violence to try and overturn it. Right the way through from the second pillar of democracy after that basic premise is the rule of law. The rule of law that applies to leaders as much as it does to the rest of us. Something that authoritarian leaders, the very first thing they try to undermine is the rule of law as it applies to them. Then a whole series of innovations, mainly in the American Revolution, and the written constitution that everyone has to abide by, separation of powers, checks and balances, not only on the leader, but on all sorts of officials within society. the separation of religion and state, which was really about, it's interesting to read about that, because at the time, of course, there were religious wars raging in Europe. And one of the things that the founding fathers in the US wanted to do was not to have that happen in America. So and it was actually an accommodation, not that religion would be suppressed, but that actually multiple religious denominations or religious things would be allowed to coexist, but no single one would be able to dominate. And that idea of no single ideology, if you like, dominating, isn't just important in terms of religion. It's important in terms, if you think about in terms of communism, if you think in terms of what happened in Cambodia, what happened under Mao and so on, where a single ideology is imposed, but you think about what's happening in North Korea at the moment. And the forbidding rulers from imposing a single mode of thought on a population is also a defense against these individuals and their influence. The final pillars in democracy, if you like, in this broader view of democracy as a defense against pathology, is what happened after the Second World War, the whole human rights framework, the protection of human rights and law, which was a response largely to Nazi, the architects of the Nazi regime, who again during the Nuremberg trials was saying the murder of 6 million Jews was legal in Germany. It was our right to do that. And so the protection for individual human rights, which shifts power from the state to an individual. Every individual, you and I, have certain inalienable rights that no government, no leader has the right to contravene. So human rights law is an enormous protection against it. And the last one finally, which is the European Union is the biggest example of, is the sharing of power between governments. The fact that governments do not have this sole authority in areas, but that the interests of citizens can be better reflected by governments sharing sovereignty, pooling sovereignty, giving up certain aspects in order that the collective gain rather than a single nation. So that's kind of the two ideas I wanted to introduce at this side. The idea of pathocracy, which is the exact opposite, if you like, of the idea of democracy. And we can talk about it in the discussion, because I think one of the things that's quite obvious at the moment is that democracy has been breached in certain places. These defenses have failed. We have leaders who are certainly not Democrats in the sense of wanting to have democratic argument, having the rule of law and human rights apply to all, and so forth. So democracy is failing, and there's a huge discussion that needs to happen. What other defenses do we now need? What other democratic innovations? People who went before us did it in the American Revolution, after the Second World War. Our generation needs to do it now in order to protect against these people for the generations that are to come.